Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, a Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story entry. This one has a somewhat unusual story, however. You notice, of course, that Isaac Asimov's name is not anywhere on the cover. Well, it seems like Astounding only puts a single story on its cover anyway. But furthermore, he is not anywhere, apparently, on the table of contents either. Indeed, the only place to find out where he is in something called the very last entry here, probability 0. Way out at page 111. And underneath that it just says, calling all liars. So, what happened to that exactly? Well, let's take a look at it. Well, I'm not going to do 111 just yet. There's a little bit. Probability 0 are supposed to be anywhere from 500 to 1,000 words, roughly. And very short stories. And they have to have a certain motif to them. And the idea was that these were a chance for aspiring new writers to get an entry on the pages of Astounding Science Fiction. For someone who's got a brain on their head and just needs a chance to have a story of theirs seen and read and heard and known. And there's a handful of occasions where this actually even worked out. In most cases, I don't think much came of it. But that's sort of the premise of this whole thing. I'm going to read immediately after that comes In Times to Come, and he's talking about what has happened in 3 stories. Okay. And then he says, and this is the editor, which I guess would be John Campbell, and that, gentlemen, is to suggest what I want from probability 0. The little items preceding were concocted, of course, by a sound trio of first-class professional liars. And unlike at this short, some 500 to 750 words, well, not even 1,750, I think there ought to be a number of excellent amateur liars, though. There may or may not be a probability 0 next month. The succeeding issue, however, will certainly have one concocted by amateurs, and professionals alike. This month's supply of examples were bought at our standard space rates. Hereafter, probability 0 will be conducted as an open contest, wherein anyone equipped with a good, sound prevarication is welcome. Readers will be invited to vote for the best of those published. The author of the winner will get $20. Second place acquires 10, and third gets our check for 5. I guess they're going to have 3 of these things, so they have to wait till they get 3 of them to come in. Checks will be mailed as soon as the issue is decided. To define the essence of the thing, we want science-fictional masterpieces that sound almost possible, but which are, as the department title states, probability 0, impossible by reason of known scientific law or by definition. They must be typed, double-spaced, and on one side of the usual size typewriter paper. The old gag about truth being stranger than fiction is founded soundly. Many an actual truth is highly implausible. We're looking for the exact reverse, something that's absolutely untrue, but highly plausible sounding. For instance, it is a fact that a powerful jet of air, a real roaring blast of air, will not only blow a ball away, it will hold even a solid, fairly dense ball, like a billiard ball, supported in mid-air, pulling it back into the hardest, fastest part of the air blast if it tries to waver out. That is obviously implausible, but it happens to be true. Some of us have probably seen stuff like this. So you just have a little blower blowing air, and you have like a little ball. Usually, you don't want to use a billiard ball because that'd be really heavy. You need a huge blast of air. But a little small toy one could be had and might hold like a little ping pong ball or a little styrofoam ball, and it just sits there. It's fascinating to watch this thing kind of wobble. It doesn't just blow off. It just, for some reason, it wobbles this way, and it just comes right back in. It's naturally stable. It's almost like levitation. Well, it is kind of a form of levitation, but it's not magnetic. It's just moving air. Pretty amazing. Okay. That one I can figure out. Helps that I've seen one. Okay. Okay, now, it is also true that if you have a rope or chain running rapidly over two pulleys with a considerable amount of slack in the chain, you can bend the chain's course into a loop and have the loop stay there after removing the original deflecting force. The rapidly moving chain will faithfully trace a course around the obstacle long after it has been removed, following a complicated S-course even though under considerable tension. That's a rather implausible fact. I think I have to see that to even understand what that was talking about, because I've never seen anything like that. Let's just say I played with hoses. I haven't seen that one happen, but maybe it's different for hoses than from chains or whatever this is, or ropes. I don't know. So, at any rate, that's a rather implausible fact. If facts can be that implausible, a good plausible lie should be fairly easy. Now, this reminds me of something I saw Asimov do several stories ago. You might remember the story Super Neutron, in which this honorable society of Ananias always has to come together and come up with some lie. And if you can prove that it's a lie, the guy coming up with it pays for everybody's dinner. If you can't, then I guess somebody else pays for the dinner, and I'm not quite sure how that's supposed to work. But at any rate, Isaac Asimov never thought of another Honorable Society of Ananias story, unlike Black Widowers or Union Club Mysteries. Though it was intended to be a series, no other such story ever existed. And he showed this thing to John Campbell, and John didn't take it. It's in another magazine. But he had seen the concept, and now it's kind of come out, and I think that's kind of what this is. Kind of an Honorable Society of Ananias, now courtesy of our editor. Now let's look at the stories briefly first. Alright, there's a story called Some Curious Effects of Time Travel by L. Sprague de Camp. Well, okay, that's one story. Look at this. Oh, this is a cute picture. I just had to look at this. I like that. A rabbit pulling a magician out of his hat. Cute. Love that. Okay. But we're not doing stories of L. Sprague de Camp today. Okay. And there's another one called Pig Trap by Malcolm Jameson. Yeah. Not as well known. I mean, L. Sprague de Camp is pretty well known, established science fiction writer. Malcolm Jameson apparently did also have some degree of being established at the time this came out. But I don't know how many people have heard him today. But at any rate, he was known. Alright. And then we have a little entry here called Time Pussy. Let's get this show here. Time Pussy by George E. Dale. George E. Dale. Well, there's no known George E. Dale that ever became famous in science fiction. Or is there? George E. Dale was a pseudonym of Isaac Asimov. He wrote this story. He tells the story a little bit about it in the early Asimov. Here we go again. Okay. And he is finally able to put the story under his own name. So, at any rate, this is the first appearance of any of his material under a pseudonym. Well, there's a couple more in his career that I know or care about. And, so, Time Pussy, I have not been able to discern any difference between what's in here, or any typos even. I don't know, it's hard to want to read it very many times and very carefully. It's not a very interesting story, and that's the one downer on the whole thing. He knows some guy named Mac who used to be an asteroid hunter. And then on one of the asteroids, Pallas, I think, one of those four greatest ones, Ceres and Vesta and Pallas, and I think Juno. Anyway, Pallas. There were apparently these weird sort of animals that were four-dimensional, not exactly cat, but kind of cat-like creatures. And by four-dimensional, it digests its food before it eats it. It complains about the presence of a burglar a day, or maybe even two in some cases, before the burglar even shows up. And then they're dying out. Unfortunately, the human visitors to Pallas brought a common cold, which was killing them off slowly over a year or so. And they're trying to preserve them because, hey, these are four-dimensional animals. That's innards, well, do some very weird things, obviously. So what ends up happening here is now that they die, they want to try to preserve one, and they find they can't. They even try to freeze one instantaneously. They do a fairly good job of it, but it still isn't good enough. And they had it full of water, and the water turned to ice in a quarter of a second. That would be interesting to see. And it was still no good because the ice was still warm. Okay. Yeah, it's improbable. I don't think they made it sound very probable. And apparently John Campbell wasn't too enthusiastic. In fact, when he told Isaac Asimov he was doing this probability 0 and wanting a story from Isaac and from the other two authors that he solicited these stories, Isaac Asimov wrote one story called Big Game. Didn't sell. And in fact, in the early Asimov, Big Game was presumed to have been lost. And then later on, somebody found it among all his papers that had been archived at Boston University. Well, we'll get to that story a whole lot later. I hope we get that far. When it actually sees print. So, the next one he writes is called First Law. It's a robotic story. But this is not the usual first law, a robot must not harm a human being nor through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. This is a whole different first law. I'll leave it at that. We'll get to that story in about 1956 stories. I hope we get that far at least. Okay. So that's so he writes one more, and it was Time Pussy, and even then John Campbell was like, I'm not going to have you do any more of these. I'll just take this as is, and it'll have to be kind of a crude example. So he took it, there it is, and it appears under the name of George E. Dale. And so, in this case, the story of the story is, I think, more interesting than the story itself. And I think that's all I have to say on that one. Anyway, but we got to do it all. One other thing I do know about this Time Pussy. It's a kind of short story, very gimmicky. As we get into the 1950s, we find he has more stories of that nature. They're kind of short, they're kind of silly, and they're not very great. At that point, it starts becoming difficult to make reasonable comparisons to such early failures as Magnificent Possession or Christmas on Ganymede. Those were just plain poor. The others are, he knows what he's doing. He's a professional writer, but it strikes his fancy that something could be cute or funny or something, and he'll come up with some little short fluff piece. And in most cases, I think the fluff pieces are just not very interesting at all. And it's hard to compare one against the other because it's like they're failures, but they're just different kinds of failures. The initial failures are the failures of somebody young, inexperienced, and just in no real position to gauge the strength or lack thereof of his own material. Whereas these others are written by somebody who really should know better. And this time pussy kind of serves as a precedent of that. Anyway, that's all I have for time pussy. Thank you for listening.